Hello once again, everyone. So, as promised, I am going to continue now with our second episode of Nitty Gritty. Last time we talked about the lower body, right? Specifically in regards to how the core is being supported by the legs, and in regards to stance, in regards to how I push, what I activate, etc. We will be returning there eventually, but I want to kind of go over now the general things up here. Now, by up here, what am I talking about? What I'm talking about is, as we talked about last time, the core is up, holding me, thus giving me a sense of lightness in all of my limbs. Right? The same is true for the chest, shoulders, and back. So we're not necessarily worried about handwork here. We're worried about how all of this can do different things, specifically in regards to that motion. One shoulder forward, one shoulder back, sometimes even less distinct than that, a little more subtle. So that's what we're going to kind of focus on here. Now, upper body work is a big subject because that snowballs into a lot of things. Lower body, it all kind of generally boils down to, advance, gather, pass, lunge, blah, blah, blah. Upper body, there's so many different variations because that's where the majority of our differences come from. So, today, generalized. If there's something specific that you're like, hey, what about this? Look at it as to how these principles can influence that for now. Okay. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about the same sort of philosophy. A good stance. When I stand in regards to passing style footwork, as with my hips, keeping them facing my opponent so that way they can apply force equally regardless of what foot is forward, regardless of which side I'm moving to, because it's all about just getting that core against my opponent, so too are my shoulders. Regardless of which hand is going forward, regardless of what angle it is going forward from, I always want it to be doing the same thing, almost exactly the same thing. There are some situations where that changes, but they are few. Essentially, what I want to make sure I'm doing at barest minimum is keeping my chest toward my opponent. Now that's pretty easy on paper. When it comes to encouraging it to do that job, much like with our core and our legs supporting our hips being able to move, so too can the core and now the posture of the neck support the chest. So when I went into my good stance before, I spread my legs out, I flared my knees, and I sank. When it comes to my good stance for my upper body, and this is one that I particularly struggle with, but it does work. I lift with my ribs, I lift with my chin, and I open with my chest. This is particularly useful if you're doing armor. The purpose of this is being down here and angry doesn't really get you anything. It just brings your head further forward, closes off your shoulders. If we were using our shoulders as protection, that'd be different. But for swords, up. You can see, you can fight, you're awake. Right now, when I stand this way, I can actually feel my rhomboids, so that's those two strips of muscle on either side of your spine, waking up. I can feel this being open. I can feel a slight tension in the lower part of my rib cage. And this ensures now that this is ready to go the same way this is ready to go. Even if I'm standing linearly, this same thing will apply, but we'll get back there again in a moment. Open, lift, ready to go. And again, I get that sense of lightness here. Now, some stances will advocate for a shoulder being more forward or back. Before we get to those minor differences, we need to talk a little bit about this kind of rotation. Now, with the hips, that can happen without necessarily a ton of change because I can apply my hips in by literally changing the distance at which I am standing. I can do the same with my shoulder, but because it is connected to my legs, I often go further with my upper body than my lower body. Right? And this is actually one of those things where probably if you're having trouble blowing through something or just getting through something or even protecting yourself against something when it comes to creating a wedge, odds are if your upper body is already at its max and you still can't achieve that, it's because you need to move your feet. Best defense, no be there. But I digress. Point is, there comes a point when I bring this across that I have gone too far. Usually your sweet spot is going to be a nice diagonal line from this shoulder to this hip and vice versa. So let's talk about extension and how that plays into that turn, right? So firstly, extension. Just like with my legs when I did pass and I had that just straightforward relatively, when it comes to my arms, I'm going to just go ahead and bring them up for this purpose. What it should be is from their resting place forward. And forward is powered not by me throwing my arm forward, but merely by me reaching. The word that I like to use a lot more than anything else is extend. Because cut, hit, strike, those all add this upwardness to it. And that's kind of what we want to mitigate. If I want to strike with upwardness, I should start in a place that already gives me that. So, for just now, we're going to focus on extension, and we'll get back to those places another time. So, push your arm forward, your shoulders staying relatively even. I don't want to be getting more than I need out of one shoulder at the cost of the other. Out, and then both arms, out. So that way both are just doing their job. It's really more like throwing something, like a little pass of a ball, than it is anything else. Now then, once I've got this, I can start applying more or less rotational force to it with my core. So I can extend out. Now, I am not breaking my rule here. I am not sacrificing one shoulder to get more extension. I'm just applying my extension across my body. I like to divide this into lanes. Center game, the game to my left, the game to my right. And then, of course, there's high versions of those. When I extend across, that's all I'm doing. My torso slightly turns, but my shoulders are still even. I'm not over-profiling. With both arms, this is especially important because if I start doing that, this guy gets really long, this guy gets really short. So with both of them together, if I can get into the habit of moving that as one piece, they're still applying equally. And the same is true on the other side, right? Especially on this side, because when you start to come into actually holding a lever, they need to start doing minute jobs that we'll get to when we get to handwork, right? Boom. Now, from that extension, that's the smallest way, where I'm just taking my torso and moving that chest beacon to one game or the other. Nothing too complicated here, right? More I can add to that is now adding the feet into it, wherein when I extend, I bring a whole side of my body forward. Now what I mean by this is I want to think about my shoulder and my hip as being tethered. Not all the time, of course, right? There will be certain instances or certain postures where that is not 100% true, but I like to think of it most of the time as they are. When I push forward, my goal is to bring this whole side to bear. Now, again, this cannot come at the cost of my other side. I don't want to get into the habit, especially when I'm striking widely or from far angle, of putting so much in one boat that this is now gone. That's not to say that there won't be a situation in which you do that. That's not to say that there won't even be situations in which that's the right call. But for right now, not what we're looking for. For right now, we're focused on that overall wholeness. So when I push, I'm keeping these engaged and keeping these square too. This will form very good middle line strikes, or thrusts for that matter, right? Even if I'm adding more of a thrust motion, same thing. This is true on both sides as well. Now, not too complicated, let's talk about a slightly more extreme version of that, wherein now, just like I loaded my leg, I load my shoulders. Now this can be done in a couple different ways, the easiest of which being literally just to kick your dominant shoulder back, right? This can allow you to add more to your extension. So essentially what I want to think about here is I've got baseline, extend, across from baseline, so that's extra added to it. And then I can think about more to baseline, wherein when I add that third part, I get not only this, I get not only this, that push, but I also get more out of the initial push. So while I don't go over here as much unless I choose to, I get much more extension overall. The trick with this is when you load, make sure it is just that turn of the body, not anything opening up like this, right? Load. Then from there, push. Still square, still engaged. Especially when I add my feet into it, right? Be it I'm going from here, push, or be it I'm now adding more feet into it, same idea. That's kind of the main torque, and you're not necessarily, playing around with it on your right side is a good way to learn it. The place I find most people experience it though, and the place that goodness knows I'm the most familiar with it, would be coming around with that hard left strike. Because let's be honest, that's where most of our as right-handers strikes land. The big thing here being extend rather than overturn. If this gets too much, this side throwing back, you're stuck. Boom, right? It's the same thing as boom, it's the same thing as boom, it's the same thing as boom. Shoulders, hips applied pretty much the same way. Now, let's move down and start talking, not down, let's move on and start talking about extension in a linear plane. What are our shoulders doing then? Because now one is cast back. So, for linear, the idea here now is it's about the same thing my hips are about. In fact, you really want to think of this not as different leg, different arm, but sides. The loaded side and the free side, the extending side. And they'll trade roles actually, right? So, when I extend my arm, it should not be from the outside of my shoulder. Keep your elbow in, right? When I move into whatever position, right? It is always with that elbow in. Even if I'm in something like an outside guard or what have you, that elbow needs to be lined up straight to my center so it can extend in its most natural way. Just like this leg is loaded. When I push forward, my shoulder needs to remain down in its socket. I'm not trying to get anything extra. I'm not letting my core start to outrun my posture. Just like we talked about in being overloaded here, so too can you overload yourself here. In fact, that's usually why that happens. So, arm, just natural extension. The next bit when we push forward is the idea of what is this side doing. Now, to illustrate this best, I'm going to go ahead and move into something that most people think is relatively silly but has a great purpose. The hand being up. Now you can achieve this same thing from the hand being attached to you or even the hand being held in front of you. The important thing is the hand is active, never lazy. So, loaded, loaded, engaged, engaged, extension, and now when I open this side out, extension. And that idea here is, as I push my hips forward and this receives weight, this pushes the weight and my hips remain square, so too, this opening up allows me to profile myself to a natural extent without giving me too much, which gives me the ability to apply as much as I can in that forward line. And what I feel when I do this, besides a really good warrior too, is it's a straight line. Like I'm two parallel bars, shoulders and hips, applying to target. And then when I reload, I do the same thing. I now bring those bars, they go from parallel to the ground to vertical. In fact, that's often how I kind of think about this, right? Vertical, vertical, parallel, or rather horizontal. Either way, the same thing, like I said, can be achieved with your hand on your hip, or your hand on your torso, or your hand here. Whenever I cast this shoulder back, which I'm not really doing, it's more that I'm lining it up behind my lead shoulder. It's doing its job, right? So here's that down the middle. See how it applies in a nice straight line, bringing me all lined up. Now that can change depending upon what you're doing. So just like we talked about up here, let's now start talking about applying that alignment to the two lines. So, in regards to applying to my inside line, this is going to be the most natural to do. Just like here, it's the most natural to do because this arm would extend the farthest, but we're going toward this arm, so everything works out in the end. It's the opposite the other way. This arm will extend the farthest. We're going this direction, so this will open most naturally. When I push, if I want to apply energy in here, that's nothing, not difficult in the slightest. Just shift it over. As long as my shoulders are lined up, everything's great, grand, and wonderful. When it comes to applying to the outside, that's where it can change. Now you can get all of your power by doing this still the same, but even when I do one without turning, I am still focused on lining those shoulders up, but they're not as lined up as they were when I was going here. They're just a little bit more square. And the reason I want that is because to apply energy on your outside line is hard. It is. Which means that I need my torso just a little bit more square. I am strongest against this direction when I'm like this, strongest when this shoulder comes forward on the outside. This is where I will oftentimes bring that shoulder even more so forward. So, extend, and when I lunge, I can still profile, but my shoulder is not throwing it back as far. I'm keeping these just a little bit more forward, and I actually tether my shoulder to my hand to my hip when I'm doing this with back sword or things along those lines, or small sword. It kind of almost brings my hip forward to ensure that I have energy in this plane. Even when I'm casting my arm back, I do the same thing. It's still in the same tether. Now you can make this more dramatic, especially if you wish to, like you really need to apply a lot of force, by bringing that shoulder forward in a different way. And this is what I often do right here, wherein if I need to apply energy here, I will push, quite literally, this shoulder up. And while my hand comes here and it looks like it's reinforcing, it's only reinforcing in regards to telling my posture what to do. It is not actually pushing, or can. There's that now from the side. Now this also has some ramifications for the lower half of my body. This hip comes forward. Now we're less in our lunge where we had our right angle, and a lot more in this 45, which is a lot more like here. But that's okay because everything's still fired the same way, and I'm just applying my energy laterally. You'll also notice that when I bring that shoulder forward, even at my most upright, I will start to incline more forward because I am putting my hip more into that hole. And if you choose to do this, this is fine. So basically, the long and short of it when it comes to turning our shoulders or extending our arms, in this case, the base level, same as we did here, it's about to what degree off of center line, left line, right line, you're looking to apply that energy. And it should be noted as well, whenever you do this, don't throw your shoulder back, regardless of how good of an idea it seems. Merely either line it up behind what you're trying to extend, or keep it assisting what you're trying to extend. Now, there will be situations where those lines blur significantly, and we may get to them down the line. But for right now, one of the most important things, and the reason I'm making this video, is to get you thinking about these two things as a unit. Because we don't want this to end up doing all the work and getting hurt, and this just being a useless training wheel. You've got two hands. Even when you're only using a single-handed sword, you've got two hands. And I don't just mean that in regards to grappling. I mean that in regards to support. Because if humans only needed one arm, we wouldn't have this other arm. So, when it comes to passing style stuff, like I said, keep it square, extend, let that shoulder come forward as it needs to apply energy where it needs to, right? And that's true on both sides. We'll get more into that as time goes on. When it comes to linearity, it's all about alignment, however you see fit, to whatever line you feel you need to do that. Hopefully this gives something for people to chew on. The more I think about both shoulders being part of the same, the more I start using my core, the more I start using my chest, and then in turn the lighter my weapons become, because if you're all focused on just down here, which is its own zone we'll get to, you're gonna have problems. So, let this support here, let this also be support from here, because really it's less about your stance makes everything else better, and much more about your core is supported and thus adds support to these two different sides, like an hourglass. Hopefully that's helpful. Please let me know your thoughts, and I will probably, I don't know what I'm going to tackle next because this is a big topic and we could go a bunch of different places next, so I may let people chew on this for a little bit, see how it is, and then move in from there. But otherwise, thank you very, very much for watching. We'll go over some other techniques another time.